Hey everyone, Patrick here. I've always seen social media challenges as harmless fun, until one wrong moment turns them into something people are remembered for all the wrong reasons. From a woman throwing boiling water into freezing air during winter, to a teenager biting into a Tide Pod for views, resulting in a horrifying moment that went horribly wrong. It was January 26, 2018, a Sunday morning, at a suburban home in Austin, Texas. The backyard was narrow but well kept, the pool taking up most of the rear section behind the patio. It was already 88 degrees by 10 in the morning. Tate Drummond was 31 and had been watching short-form videos the night before when he came across a prank clip with over 12 million views. A father throws a realistic baby doll toward a pool. The mother reacts in pure panic, and the reveal produces relieved laughter. The comments were full of people tagging their partners. He ordered a weighted, realistic infant doll from an online retailer that same evening. It arrived Friday. He did not tell his wife. I've seen videos exactly like the one Tate watched. Most people have, and the comments are always the same. Hundreds of people tagging their partners, already planning to do it. This felt completely normal to him. That's the part that concerns me. On Sunday morning, he set up 3 cameras, one on the patio pergola facing the pool, one inside the kitchen window, and one handheld. He put their infant daughter, Poppy, in her bouncer in the living room with the baby monitor on, and retrieved the doll from the spare room. Zara was outside cleaning the pool with a telescopic brush, her back partially turned to the house. At 10:20 a.m., Tate came out carrying Poppy. Zara told him to take Poppy back inside without breaking her work rhythm. She said she did not want to worry about the baby while she had chemicals out. Her tone was practical. She turned back to the pool. Tate went inside, put Poppy back in her bouncer, wrapped the doll in the same muslin cloth Poppy was usually swaddled in, and went back outside. He waited 4 minutes. Then he shouted Zara's name. She turned. He threw the doll in a high arc toward the center of the pool, shouting at her to catch it. Zara reacted instantly. Her mind registered only one thing: her daughter over the water. She was already running before the doll reached the peak of its arc, her eyes fixed on the bundle instead of the ground ahead. The pool coping rose about 1.5 inches above the patio surface. Her leading foot caught it at full stride. Her momentum carried her body forward while her feet stopped. She did not dive. She did not fall into the water. She went straight down, the full weight of her body driving her forehead into the tiled coping edge before she could bring her hands up. The sound was sharp and immediate. She collapsed face down on the coping and did not move. Tate reached her within seconds. She was unconscious, blood already spreading across the tiles. The doll floated face down in the shallow end as he called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Zara was transported to a medical center with a severe traumatic brain injury, a depressed frontal skull fracture, and significant intracranial bleeding. She underwent emergency neurosurgery that afternoon to relieve pressure and control the bleeding before being placed on life support. She did not regain consciousness. On the 3rd day, scans showed no meaningful brain activity. The damage was extensive and irreversible. Zara Drummond was removed from life support on the evening of the 5th day and pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m. She was 29 years old. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury and intracranial hemorrhage consistent with high-force impact on a hard surface. Tate surrendered all 3 cameras to police voluntarily and did not delete any footage. The investigation reviewed the material in full. No charges were filed. The finding noted the absence of intent and the unforeseeable nature of the specific injury mechanism. Poppy was collected by Zara's mother that afternoon and remained there through the funeral and beyond.
It was July 19, 2019, and night had fallen across a stretch of interstate highway outside Nashville, Tennessee. The 4-lane roadway carried moderate traffic in both directions, with vehicles traveling between 65 and 75 miles per hour. Streetlights illuminated the pavement at regular intervals. Jovi Sinclair was 26 years old and worked as a stylist at a salon in a suburban shopping district, maintaining a steady base of clients. She was active on social media, posting content, related to hairstyling, fashion, and lifestyle topics, with several thousand followers. Co-workers later described her as increasingly focused on engagement metrics and follower growth. At the time, a challenge format had gained popularity involving participants filming themselves dancing to a specific song in unexpected or dangerous locations. The videos typically showed the participants standing still at first, then suddenly dancing as the music began. While many were filmed in public spaces, a subset featured participants dancing in or near active roadways, often at night, with traffic risk treated as part of the appeal. That evening, Jovi had been driving with a friend who agreed to help film content. They were returning from dinner and traveling on the interstate when Jovi suggested attempting the challenge. Her friend later reported discouraging the idea due to safety concerns, but Jovi insisted the setting would make the video more dramatic. Jovi directed her friend to pull onto the shoulder about 2 miles from the nearest exit. The shoulder was narrow and separated from the right travel lane by a white stripe. Traffic remained steady. Visibility was adequate under streetlights, but the speed difference between stopped vehicles and passing traffic exceeded 70 miles per hour. Her friend stopped with hazard lights activated and began recording from the driver's window. After briefly pausing and glancing toward traffic, Jovi exited the car and stepped into the right travel lane, positioning herself roughly 15 feet from the vehicle. She was wearing dark clothing that offered little contrast against the pavement. Her plan was to remain still until the music started, then perform a short dance lasting about 15 seconds. As the recording began, Jovi stood motionless while vehicles approached from behind. Several drivers moved into the left lane to avoid her, and at least 2 honked as they passed. Jovi then began dancing, focused on the camera rather than oncoming traffic. Investigators later estimated that a sedan in the right lane was approximately 200 feet behind her when the driver first perceived her. The driver stated she appeared suddenly in his headlights, and at highway speed there was no time to brake or change lanes safely. The vehicle struck Jovi at an estimated 70 miles per hour. The driver braked immediately and stopped about 150 feet beyond the impact point. Jovi's friend called emergency services as other vehicles stopped and witnesses approached. Paramedics and State Highway Patrol arrived within 8 minutes. Jovi was found with injuries incompatible with survival and was pronounced dead at the scene. The driver was not injured and was not charged after investigators determined he bore no fault, while Jovi's friend was cited for stopping on the interstate without emergency justification. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma. The video was restricted from public release during the investigation, and Highway Patrol later issued warnings addressing the challenge.
It was August 22nd, 2015, in a residential neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas, the kind of place where backyards bleed into each other, and weekend evenings tend to stretch longer than anyone plans for. That's where Marlo Tenby spent most of his nights off, outside, with the same small group, doing what they always did. Marlo was 31. He worked dinner shifts as a line cook at a mid-range restaurant, which meant he was rarely home before midnight and rarely in bed before 3 in the morning. Drinking was part of the wind down, not occasionally, consistently. Most nights ended with a few drinks at minimum, and on weekends, it went further than that. He had built his entire social identity around being the one in the group who could handle more than everyone else. And honestly, looking back at how this night unfolded, that reputation might have been the most dangerous thing about him. The Neck Nomination Challenge had been circulating through social feeds since early 2015. The format was simple: film yourself drinking something, post it, then nominate someone else to do the same. It started as a straightforward drinking dare, but escalated quickly as people tried to outdo whoever nominated them. By the time it reached Marlo's circle, the whole point was to make the person before you look like they played it safe. When his nomination came through on the evening of August 22nd, he didn't hesitate. 3 people were already in his backyard: 2 friends who had been there since early evening, and a neighbor who had wandered over an hour in. Marlowe set his own phone against a cooler, asked one of the friends to hold a second phone for a wider angle, and started putting the mixture together. What he prepared was not a standard drink. He poured what witnesses later estimated at around 8 to 10 shots worth of straight whiskey into a large cup. He added hot sauce, a raw egg, and then he went inside and came back with a standard over-the-counter sleep aid box, punching out 4 tablets and crushing them into the cup before anyone could say much about it. I've had nights where a couple of drinks in, your judgment just stops working the way it should. By the time he reached for those tablets, I think that switch had already flipped. Diphenhydramine, the active compound in most over-the-counter sleep aids, is a central nervous system depressant on its own. Combined with a large volume of alcohol, it compounds the sedative effect significantly, slowing breathing and central nervous system activity in a way that neither substance would reach alone at those quantities. In someone with a high alcohol tolerance, the early warning signs are easier to miss because the body is already conditioned to push through them. One of the friends told him the mixture looked wrong and suggested he leave out the tablets. Marlowe dismissed it and finished preparing the cup. Both phones were already recording. He drank the entire mixture in one continuous effort, lasting roughly 40 seconds. He stayed upright afterward, talked, seemed fine. The group settled back into the evening and nobody flagged anything for the first 20 minutes. Around the 20-minute mark, his speech became harder to follow. He sat down heavily in a lawn chair about 12 feet from the back door. One friend assumed he was drunk and suggested they move inside. Marlowe declined and stayed in the chair. By the 35-minute mark, his head dropped forward and he stopped responding to his name. All 3 witnesses were present when it happened. His breathing became shallow and irregular over the next several minutes. One friend shook his shoulders repeatedly and got no response. Under the exterior light, his lips had taken on a pale coloration that one witness described as wrong. Roughly 50 minutes after finishing the drink, his breathing stopped. The neighbor was the first to recognize that what they were watching had moved well beyond someone sleeping off a bad decision. By the time that recognition landed, it had already been too late for longer than any of them realized. Marlowe was confirmed dead at the scene. The cause of death was ruled acute respiratory and central nervous system depression from the combined volume of alcohol and diphenhydramine at levels considered fatal. The mixture was reconstructed from witness accounts and the remaining contents of the cup. Both phones were recovered and reviewed as part of the record. The case was closed as an accidental death. No one present was charged. I don't know how that one friend who spoke up felt afterward, but I think about, you said the right thing. You were standing right there, and it still went the way it went.
It was June 9th, 2021, a Wednesday afternoon, inside a single-story brick home in Liège, Belgium. The curtains in the front room were half drawn against the afternoon heat. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. The television was on in the corner, volume low, tuned to a daytime program nobody was watching. Raymond Sellers was 68 and had been home for 11 days after spending 3 weeks at the hospital following an ischemic stroke. The stroke had left him with partial paralysis down his left side, reduced grip strength in both hands, and a speech pattern that required effort to produce clearly. His doctors said meaningful recovery was possible with physiotherapy and rest. What he needed above everything else was stillness and the complete avoidance of physical or emotional stress. His daughter had converted the front sitting room of their single-story brick home in Liège into a temporary bedroom so he would not need to navigate stairs. He spent most of his day in a hospital-grade wheelchair, moving between the sitting room and the back garden, where he liked to sit in the late afternoon. Raymond had always been the kind of grandfather who engaged. Backyard games, card games at the kitchen table, bad jokes delivered with complete commitment. The teenagers had grown up with that version of him. Seeing him in the wheelchair was an adjustment none of them spoke about directly. Let me be real here. I know how it feels being ill and having a support system. Raymond was actually enjoying it. Kobe Renshaw was 16 and Raymond's grandson. His teachers described him as easily distracted, but good-natured. He spent considerable time watching prank content online and owned a small handheld novelty shock device bought from a joke shop 4 months earlier. He had used it on 3 friends at school and once on his younger sister. None of them had been seriously affected. On that afternoon, Raymond was sitting in his wheelchair near the back door facing the garden. He had been in good spirits that day. He had eaten lunch without difficulty and had been more talkative than usual. Kobe had been sitting with him for 20 minutes, showing him videos on his phone, including the shock device pranks, and Raymond had laughed at 2 of them, the laugh coming out slower and more effortful than it used to, but genuine. Kobe retrieved the shock device from his hoodie pocket and held it against the back of Raymond's right hand and triggered it. Raymond's body jolted sharply in the chair. His head snapped back. For 2 or 3 seconds, he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Kobe was already grinning, pulling the device back. Then Raymond's expression changed. The color left his face immediately. His breathing became uneven. His left hand slid from the armrest. His head dropped forward. His body listed to the right, and the wheelchair, which had not been locked, rolled slightly. He went sideways out of the chair and down onto the tiled floor before Kobe could reach him. Kobe shouted for his mother. She found Raymond on the floor, conscious but unable to respond properly to her voice, his breathing shallow and irregular. She called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. His blood pressure was critically elevated, and he was showing signs consistent with a second acute cerebrovascular event. Doctors later believed the sudden panic and stress response had likely triggered a dangerous spike in blood pressure in a patient whose vascular system was already severely compromised from the earlier stroke. He was transported to a university hospital under emergency conditions. He died later that evening. The cause of death was determined to be a second ischemic stroke occurring in the context of severe pre-existing cerebrovascular damage and acute cardiovascular stress. Kobe was interviewed by police with his parents present. He surrendered the device and described what he had done without minimizing it. He had not known. That was the consistent and uncontested finding. No charges were filed. Raymond's wheelchair remained in the back room for weeks after the funeral, still facing the garden where the flowers had just come into bloom. After researching this next one, I almost pulled it from the batch entirely, because it involves a dumb decision. Far in Brazil, a man decided to house a lion and decided the lion's mealtime was a time to have fun.
It was February 21st, 2018, when late evening darkness had settled over a residential neighborhood in suburban Phoenix. Most homes showed interior lights, and the street was quiet with little traffic. The temperature had cooled into the mid-50s after a warm day, and the neighborhood remained still as residents settled in for the night. Brennan Cade was 21 years old and attending a local community college part-time while working at a retail electronics store. He rented a room in a house shared with 2 other young men in their early 20s. Housemates later reported he spent much of his free time alone in his room watching online videos. Friends described him as easily bored and frequently seeking attention from his social circle through humor or risky stunts. During late 2017 and early 2018, a dangerous challenge had gained notoriety online. Participants filmed themselves biting into laundry detergent pods, single-use packets containing highly concentrated liquid detergent. The challenge was framed as shocking humor, with the unpleasant taste and obvious danger treated as part of the appeal. Most participants bit the pod briefly and spat out the contents without swallowing. The pods contained concentrated surfactants and enzymes sealed under pressure within a thin, water-soluble membrane. When ruptured inside the mouth, the contents could cause severe irritation to oral and airway tissues. If inhaled, the detergent could penetrate deep into the lungs, disrupting normal gas exchange and triggering chemical pneumonitis. Manufacturers had issued repeated warnings, and poison control centers had documented thousands of accidental exposures in young children. Intentional exposure by young adults attempting the challenge represented a newer and growing category of cases, with several hospitalizations already reported. That evening, Brennan's housemates had gone out for the night. Shortly after 11 o'clock, he decided to attempt the challenge himself. Believing he could control the exposure, he retrieved a pod from the laundry room and set up his phone on the kitchen counter, positioning it to capture his face and upper body. He did not wear gloves or take any protective measures, assuming the exposure would be brief and manageable. He began recording and bit into the pod. The membrane ruptured completely, releasing the pressurized contents into his mouth and throat. The reaction was immediate. Brennan bent over the sink, coughing violently as some of the detergent was aspirated into his airway. Between coughing episodes, his breathing became erratic and shallow as airway inflammation progressed. Rapid inflammation followed, and a swelling in his throat made breathing increasingly difficult. Attempts to rinse his mouth were ineffective as coughing intensified, leaving him unable to speak or call for help. One of his housemates returned early and found Brennan gasping at the sink. He called emergency services immediately while trying to assess Brennan's condition. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes and found Brennan in severe respiratory distress with critically low oxygen levels. Assisted ventilation was initiated, and he was transported to a regional trauma center. Despite aggressive emergency care, severe lung injury prevented adequate oxygen exchange. Brennan suffered cardiac arrest from progressive hypoxia and could not be resuscitated. He was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours after the exposure. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by respiratory failure following detergent aspiration. Investigators later reviewed the phone recording to confirm the sequence of events, and local officials issued renewed warnings about the risks associated with online challenge content.
It was October 31st, 2019, Halloween night, on a suburban street in Naperville, Illinois. The neighborhood was active in patches, porch lights left on for passing children, small groups moving between properties with bags already heavy by 7 in the evening. Sienna Hartley was 34 and worked at a radiology clinic. She had finished her shift 2 hours earlier than expected and driven home in good spirits, already thinking about the night. She and her husband Dane had been together for 9 years, married for 5. He was not easy to scare. She had tried before and he had laughed both times before she had even finished setting up. He had a way of seeing things coming. She decided this time would be different. Sienna changed into a full-length white dress she had bought for a costume party 2 years earlier and applied pale theatrical makeup across her face and hands. She pulled a sheer white fabric over her head that partially obscured her features. She texted her closest friend, Brooke Sanderson, 29, and explained the plan. Brooke agreed immediately. "I have to be honest, the planning in this one is what gets me." She had put real thought into this. She wanted to finally get him, and she did. Dane was 36 and worked as a site supervisor for a civil construction company. He arrived home at 6:48 p.m., changed, and was sitting in the living room with a beer when his phone rang at 7:15 p.m. It was Brooke. She told him there had been an incident, that Sienna had been in a minor accident on the way home from a dinner she had supposedly been attending, that she was shaken but okay and needed him to come quickly to an address 2 suburbs over. She used a tone of controlled urgency she had practiced once in the car before calling. Dane was out the front door in under 2 minutes. Sienna had been lying flat across the back seat of his car for just over 20 minutes. She had climbed in through the rear passenger door while he was inside changing, pulling the door to without fully latching it to avoid the sound. Dane, already rushing after hearing Brooke's call, never walked around the vehicle before getting in. As he drove, his attention stayed fixed on the navigation screen and the repeated calls Brooke sent to keep him moving quickly. The angle of the driveway and the height of the rear seats kept her out of view from the front. She heard him unlock the car and get in. Dane reversed out of the driveway and pulled onto the street, driving with urgency, phone mounted on the dash with the address already loaded in navigation. He merged onto the main road and accelerated to the posted limit of 35 miles per hour. Sienna waited until he had been driving for approximately 90 seconds. Then she slowly raised herself upright in the back seat and reached one hand forward, placing it on his right shoulder. Dane reacted before he could think. His body twisted sharply to the right, his hands pulling the wheel with it. The car crossed the center line. He overcorrected left. The vehicle lost stability and rotated, the passenger side striking a parked van on the opposite curb, before continuing into a utility pole and coming to rest. Sienna was unrestrained in the back seat. The impact threw her forward and then sideways. Her head struck the doorframe before she came to rest on the floor behind the driver's seat. She did not make a sound after that. Dane was conscious. His airbag had deployed. He had a laceration across his forearm and a deep bruise forming across his sternum from the seatbelt. He turned around and found her on the floor, still in the white dress. She was breathing. He called 911 at 7:21 p.m. Paramedics arrived at 7:28 p.m. Sienna was extracted and transported to hospital with a severe traumatic brain injury consistent with blunt force impact. She underwent emergency surgery that night. She died on November 3rd, 4 days later, without having regained consciousness. The cause of death was severe traumatic brain injury sustained during the collision. Dane was treated at the scene for minor injuries and interviewed by police the following morning. Brooke was also interviewed. Both gave full accounts. The investigation found no evidence of criminal offending. The coroner recorded the death as accidental. Dane did not return to the house for 6 weeks. When he did, the plastic skeletons were still zip-tied to the mailboxes on either side of his driveway. The neighbors had forgotten to take them down.
It was March 2016, and the finished basement of a modest split-level home in suburban Cincinnati had been set up for a poker night. Fluorescent lights hummed above folding tables scattered with chips and cards, while folding chairs lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of beer and microwave popcorn as muted traffic noise drifted in through narrow ground-level windows. Robert Hensley was 58 years old and had spent 23 years managing warehouse operations for a regional food distribution company, coordinating shipments and supervising dock crews across 2 shifts. He stood 6 feet tall with a heavy build, weighing approximately 240 pounds. Friends described him as dependable but stubborn, particularly when it came to medical care. Over the past year and a half, he had experienced intermittent episodes of chest pressure that had gradually become more frequent, but he had not visited a doctor in more than 6 years, dismissing the symptoms as indigestion and work-related stress tied to deadlines and staffing shortages. Poker nights had become part of Robert's routine. Most Saturdays, he met the same 4 friends at rotating homes, rarely missing a game unless work required overtime. That evening, the host told Robert the game would begin at 7, encouraging him to come on time. What Robert didn't know was that 8 additional friends had arrived downstairs nearly an hour earlier, positioning themselves behind furniture and inside a small storage closet. They wore inexpensive horror masks purchased earlier that afternoon. They later told investigators they were only intending to startle him as a birthday surprise before revealing cake and gifts. While waiting, the group drank several beers, growing louder and less coordinated as the hour passed. The basement's layout featured multiple blind corners and a narrow stairwell entrance that funneled sound, creating an enclosed space where sudden noise echoed sharply off the concrete walls. Around 7:15, Robert descended the wooden staircase into the basement. The room appeared empty and dim, except for a single lamp near the far wall. As he reached the bottom step and called out for his friends, all 8 participants emerged at once from their hiding spots, shouting and moving quickly toward him with masks covering their faces. Witnesses later reported that Robert froze in place for several seconds, his shoulders tensing as his posture stiffened. His face drained of color as he staggered backward into the stairwell wall. Both hands moved to his chest as his breathing became shallow and irregular. He attempted to speak, but only a strained choking sound came out as he struggled to remain upright. Within moments, his movements became uncoordinated. He slid down the wall and collapsed heavily onto the basement floor. The sudden shift in tone caused the group to remove their masks immediately. Several friends rushed forward, calling his name and shaking his shoulders. When he failed to respond and no pulse could be detected, emergency services were called. CPR was initiated once it became clear he was unresponsive and not breathing normally. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes to find Robert pulseless. Resuscitation efforts continued for more than 20 minutes, but no spontaneous circulation was restored, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from an acute myocardial infarction involving the left anterior descending coronary artery, complicated by sudden cardiac arrest due to a lethal arrhythmia. Autopsy revealed widespread severe atherosclerotic disease with several coronary vessels showing critical narrowing. Investigators concluded that the stress response precipitated a fatal electrical disturbance in an already compromised cardiovascular system. Robert's family later filed a civil lawsuit against the host, which was settled out of court, and following an insurance review, the property owner prohibited all future private party gatherings at the residence. July 22, 2017. The morning traffic through Berlin's Mitte district moved steadily as commuters navigated the narrow streets connecting residential neighborhoods to the city center. Lucas Lehman, a 34-year-old accountant, pedaled his bicycle through the same route he had taken for 6 years, timing his departure to avoid the worst congestion. Lucas was methodical about everything. His colleagues at a mid-sized financial services firm described him as punctual and risk-averse, someone who planned vacation days months in advance and always double-checked his work. He cycled year-round, rain or shine, preferring the predictability of his route over the crowded subway system. His bicycle was well-maintained, his helmet always secured properly, and he followed traffic laws with the precision he applied to balance sheets. Urban cycling in Berlin's inner districts requires constant awareness of parked cars, pedestrians, and delivery vehicles sharing narrow streets, where bike lanes often disappear at intersections and cyclists must merge with traffic moving at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour in some areas. That morning, 2 content creators had set up near the bike lane to film a prank video for their online channel. They had positioned themselves on the sidewalk adjacent to the cycling path, planning to stage a heated argument that would escalate into physical shoving. The concept was simple: create a realistic-looking confrontation that would surprise passers-by and capture their reactions. No permits had been obtained and no warning signs were posted. They began filming around 8:10 in the morning during peak commuter hours when foot and bicycle traffic was heaviest. The performers started their staged altercation just as Lucas approached. One shoved the other forcefully, causing him to stumble backward toward the bike lane while both shouted loudly. The sudden movement and aggressive shouting created the illusion of a genuine assault unfolding directly in Lucas's path. Other cyclists had already passed without incident, but the timing placed Lucas at the worst possible moment. Lucas braked instinctively, but could not stop quickly enough. Faced with what appeared to be a violent confrontation spilling into his lane, he made a split-second decision to swerve left, moving out of the bike lane entirely. He veered directly into the adjacent traffic lane without looking behind him. A delivery truck, approaching from behind at roughly 30 to 35 miles per hour, hit him hard. The impact threw Lucas forward, his body colliding with the truck's front bumper before being thrown onto the pavement. His certified commuter helmet, strap fastened, split along one seam. Forensic photos later showed deformation consistent with a high-speed blunt impact. The truck driver immediately stopped and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but Lucas was unconscious and unresponsive. He was transported to a nearby hospital trauma center where he died 40 minutes later from severe brain trauma and multiple spinal fractures caused by blunt force impact. The content creators immediately ceased filming and provided statements to police. Police recovered the creators' footage, multiple bystander phone videos, and a forward-facing dash cam from the truck. Dash cam footage from the delivery truck confirmed Lucas had swerved suddenly into traffic. Witnesses verified the prank had caused the cyclist to panic and change course abruptly. Both performers faced charges for negligent homicide and creating a public hazard. The case sparked debates about unregulated street performance and social media prank culture. The bike lane was later redesigned with physical barriers separating cyclists from vehicle traffic.
It was May 26, 2017, a Friday night on a quiet residential street in Springfield, Missouri. The neighborhood was the kind where porch lights stayed off after 9 and dogs did not bother to bark at passing cars. Mr. David Hartley was 53 and had taught 10th and 11th grade English at a high school for 19 years. He was the kind of teacher students remembered, not because he was easy, but because he was present. He knew which students were struggling before they said anything. He stayed after class. His colleagues described him as steady. His students described him as someone who actually gave a damn. The Leaf tradition at a high school had been running for at least a decade. At the end of each school year, a group of senior students would select one teacher they respected, drive to that teacher's home late on a Friday night, and cover their entire front yard in leaves. Bags of them, sometimes dozens, collected over weeks. The goal was to arrive undetected, complete the job, and be gone before anyone noticed. If the teacher came out and caught them, the prank was over. Getting caught was the ending, not the escalation. Mr. Hartley had known about the tradition for years. By May of that year, he had started to suspect his turn was close. A few of his 11th grade students had been unusually pleasant in the weeks leading up to the end of term. One had asked with no obvious reason whether he lived far from school. He had smiled and said nothing. He told his wife about it that same week. He said he was looking forward to catching them. I've said before that the details that get me are never the big ones. It's always something small. And here it's this. He was looking forward to catching them. He was genuinely excited to be part of the prank. On that night, 6 11th grade students loaded 4 cars with 32 bags of dry leaves collected from parks and sidewalks across the district over the preceding 3 weekends. They drove separately and parked at staggered distances from Hartley's street on the quiet residential neighborhood where porch lights stayed off after 9 and dogs did not bother to bark at passing cars. They had agreed on silence, no phone flashlights, and a 10-minute maximum on the ground. 2 acted as lookouts. 4 went to work on the yard. By 11:40 p.m., they had emptied all 32 bags across the front lawn, the garden beds, and the path to the front door. The yard was completely buried. They were gathering the empty bags to leave when the porch light came on. Mr. Hartley appeared at the front door in sweatpants and a hoodie. He had been awake. He saw the figures on his lawn and immediately understood what was happening. He came down the front steps fast, calling out to them by name. The students scattered. Most ran toward the parked cars. One ran the wrong way toward the road end of the street and stopped at the corner under a streetlight, doubled over, and looking back at him. Mr. Hartley ran toward that student. He was moving fast, still laughing, covering the sidewalk in long strides. He did not see the concrete curb drop at the edge of the driveway crossing. His leading foot came down expecting flat ground and found a step down of about 6 inches. His ankle folded. His body pitched forward and he went down hard, his chest and face hitting the road surface as he rolled off the curb and into the lane. A refrigerated freight truck traveling at the posted limit of 35 miles per hour had no time to stop. The driver felt the impact before he understood it. He pulled over about 400 feet past the point of collision and called 911 at 11:48 p.m. Paramedics arrived at 11:56 p.m. Mr. Hartley was deceased at the scene. The cause of death was catastrophic traumatic injury consistent with a heavy vehicle strike. The 6 students were identified within 48 hours. All cooperated, and none had a prior record. The investigation found no evidence of intent to cause harm. The inquest recorded the death as accidental. No charges were filed. The high school canceled its end-of-year assembly. His 11th grade class finished their final exams 11 days later. Supervised by a substitute teacher none of them knew, the student who had been standing at the corner under the streetlight did not return to school for the remainder of the term. The leaf tradition has not been repeated since. He was laughing when he fell. The kids were laughing. That's the part I couldn't shake. That the last sound he made in his life was probably a good one.
August 14, 2018, a convenience store on the south side of Houston sat under harsh fluorescent lights, its parking lot nearly empty as the night shift began. Caleb McMullen, an 18-year-old high school graduate, had spent the evening convincing 3 friends to stage a fake armed robbery. Caleb was known among his circle for dismissing real-world consequences and mocking anyone who took safety precautions seriously. He had dropped out of community college after 1 semester, spending most of his time escalating dares and filming reactions for social media attention. Friends described him as someone who constantly pushed boundaries, believing that nothing truly dangerous would happen to him personally. He often bragged about previous pranks that had gone unpunished and ridiculed people who warned him. For 2 days, Caleb had planned the prank meticulously, purchasing an airsoft pistol from a sporting goods store and spray painting it matte black to remove any orange safety markings. He insisted the group keep everything secret from Marcus to ensure an authentic reaction, dismissing concerns from 2 friends who said the plan was dangerous and stupid. Caleb argued that nobody would actually respond with violence to what was obviously a joke of friend. He refused to inform store management or consider that other customers might be present. Marcus had not received any robbery training, and the store had no official late-night security protocol, leaving him with no guidance on how to react. At 9:47 in the evening, Caleb and 2 friends entered the store. Security footage later showed the parking lot had 3 vehicles, including one belonging to a customer inside. Caleb held the spray-painted replica pistol concealed under his jacket as they walked through the automatic doors. Marcus stood behind the counter, organizing cigarette inventory. One friend hesitated near the entrance, visibly uncomfortable. Caleb moved forward confidently toward the register. Caleb suddenly pulled the replica from his jacket and raised it toward Marcus while shouting about a robbery. His voice carried the exaggerated aggression he had practiced. Marcus froze, hands raised, face showing genuine terror. What Caleb had not accounted for was the customer standing near the refrigerated section, a 34-year-old construction worker with a valid concealed carry permit who had stopped for beverages after his shift. The customer saw a young man pointing what appeared to be a firearm at the store clerk in an aggressive robbery. He drew his legally carried handgun and fired once within 2 seconds of perceiving the threat. The 9mm round struck Caleb in the left side of his chest. Caleb staggered backward 3 steps, the replica pistol clattering onto the tile floor. He collapsed near the candy display. One of his friends immediately screamed that the gun was fake and not real, but blood was already spreading rapidly across Caleb's shirt. The other friend fled toward the exit in panic, while Marcus ducked behind the counter, grabbing the store phone. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Caleb was unresponsive with weak pulse and severe hemorrhaging from the chest wound. He was transported to a regional trauma center where he was pronounced dead at 10:31 in the evening, despite emergency surgery attempts. Paramedics noted in their report that Caleb had lost a significant amount of blood and was unresponsive upon arrival, confirming the extreme rapidity of fatal internal hemorrhage from the wound. The medical examiner determined the bullet had penetrated the left lung and nicked the left ventricle of the heart, causing massive internal bleeding and cardiac failure. Death would have occurred within minutes, even with immediate surgical intervention. Police investigation confirmed the replica pistol was visually indistinguishable from a real firearm under the store's lighting conditions and stress of the moment. The shooter was not charged after prosecutors determined his actions constituted reasonable self-defense given the circumstances he perceived. It was June 18, 2016, along a commuter rail corridor on the outskirts of Chicago, Illinois, the kind of stretch where trains move fast between stops and the surrounding infrastructure, poles, brackets, overhead lines, sits close enough to the tracks that clearance is measured in inches, not feet. That's where Benji Okafor decided to film his next piece of content. Benji was 26. He worked as a freelance videographer, building his personal brand around capturing urban stunts and posting the footage online. He had been doing it for about 2 years and had built a small but consistent following around it. Every outing was content. Every location was a set. He didn't separate the stunt from the documentation. The whole point was the footage, and the footage was the whole point. He wasn't reckless in the way most people picture when they hear about something like this. He was methodical. He scouted locations before committing to them. He thought through angles and logistics. He brought equipment, but that's the part that made my stomach drop when I first went through this case, because it wasn't carelessness that brought him here. It was confidence that had never been tested hard enough to fail. In the weeks leading up to June 18th, Benji scouted the commuter rail corridor on 2 separate occasions. He timed the trains between stations. He observed the speed. He looked at the exterior of the cars and identified a recessed door handle he could grip for the duration of the ride. The plan was to ride the outside of a single commuter car between 2 stations less than a mile apart, short enough to control, slow enough to manage. He had done a version of this once before on a different line without incident, which gave him the kind of confidence that's hard to argue with until something goes wrong. He brought a friend, Wes, to operate a second camera from the far end of the departure platform. Benji himself wore a chest-mounted action camera to capture first-person footage for the full duration of the ride. 2 angles, both rolling before the train even left the station. The train pulled out and accelerated faster than Benji had anticipated based on his observation runs. Within the first 600 feet, it was moving at approximately 34 miles per hour, faster than the speed he had built his plan around. He was already committed, pressed flat against the exterior of the 3rd car, both hands gripping the recessed door handle. At that speed, pressed against the outside of a moving train, the margin for anything unexpected shrinks to almost nothing. I don't think that registered for him at the moment. His body position placed his head and left shoulder at the outermost clearance point of the car's exterior. What he hadn't accounted for during his scouting runs was a signal housing bracket mounted on a fixed overhead support structure running alongside the corridor. The bracket sat at a fixed height above the rail bed. During his scouting, Benji had estimated his clearance based on his standing height of 6 feet even. What he didn't factor in was that gripping the door handle from the outside raised his effective height by several inches, closing the gap between his head and the bracket to almost nothing. He scouted that corridor twice and still missed it. That detail made my chest tighten the first time I read it. The bracket made contact across the upper left side of his head and shoulder as the car passed beneath it at full speed. The force of the impact separated him from the car immediately. He fell to the rail bed alongside the track. Wes captured the moment of separation from the platform. A commuter standing near the far end of the platform also witnessed him come off the train. The chest-mounted camera continued recording through the fall and captured the rail bed on impact before the feed cut out. Benji was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head from contact with the fixed overhead bracket at speed, compounded by the fall to the rail bed. The footage from both the platform camera and the chest-mounted camera was recovered and reviewed as part of the record. The case was ruled an accidental death. Wes was interviewed and no charges were filed.
It was March 5th, 2019, a Tuesday evening, inside a 2-story brick home in Mississauga, Ontario. The living room faced the staircase directly, separated by about 13 feet of open floor. Ayla Brennan was 17 and had come home from her part-time cafe shift, showered, and settled into the armchair nearest the staircase with a bag of chips and her phone. She was not paying attention to the room. The chair sat close enough to the bottom step that the right armrest nearly touched the newel post. Jackson Brennan was 14 and had been pranking his sister since middle school. He documented everything on his phone, kept most of it in a private folder, and sent some to his group chat. Ayla had complained to their parents twice in the past month. Their mother had told him to grow up. He had nodded and said nothing. Earlier that day, Jackson had found a lifelike baby doll in a box of old toys in the basement. It was dressed in a pale yellow jumpsuit. He laid it flat on the living room floor midway between the television and Ayla's chair, face up with its arms slightly extended. He tied a length of thin nylon fishing line to its ankle, ran the line along the baseboard and under the hallway door, and crouched on the other side with the spool loose in his hands. Ayla had been on her phone for most of the evening. At some point, she glanced up. The doll was moving, short, uneven pulls across the floor toward her chair, the pale yellow jumpsuit shifting with each tug of the line. She screamed and threw herself out of the chair in a single panicked motion, spinning toward the hallway. She did not register the staircase directly behind her. Her heel caught the bottom step while her body was still carrying forward momentum. The stairs took her. She went backward, her body rolling and striking each step without control. Nothing to grab in time to slow herself. She hit the bottom of the staircase with a single hard impact and stopped moving. Jackson came through the hallway door within seconds. Ayla was on her back at the foot of the stairs, one leg twisted beneath her, completely still. She was making a faint, continuous low sound. He called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Ayla was unresponsive to verbal commands. Responders identified a suspected spinal injury and immobilized her on scene before transporting her to hospital. She died in the early hours of the following morning. The cause of death was cervical spinal fracture with complete cord transection and traumatic brain injury sustained during the fall. Jackson was interviewed at the hospital with a parent present. He described the prank in full without being prompted. The fishing line was still tied to the doll when investigators processed the scene. Police completed their investigation and submitted findings to the Crown. No charges were laid, though a victim services report was filed and the case remained on file. The doll was still on the living room floor when the first officers arrived.
It was June 2017, and the afternoon sun blazed over a residential backyard in Mesa, Arizona. Heat radiated from the concrete pool deck surrounding a kidney-shaped swimming pool. The water's surface glittered under a cloudless sky, while a portable speaker played music across the property. Liam Chen was 31 years old and managed a casual dining restaurant chain location, overseeing daily operations, staff scheduling, and customer service for a facility that served approximately 400 guests per day. Standing 5'9" and weighing 170 pounds, Liam maintained an athletic build through regular gym attendance. College friends described him as competitive and image-conscious, someone who consistently positioned himself as the reliable hero in any situation requiring action or intervention. That Saturday afternoon marked an informal reunion gathering with 8 college friends at a rented property. The pool measured 40 feet long, with depths ranging from 4 feet at the shallow end to 8 feet at the deep end. Multiple warning signs posted by the property management company specifically prohibited diving in shallow water. The rental agreement explicitly outlined pool safety rules, though the host later admitted nobody had reviewed the documentation carefully. The group had been drinking beer throughout the afternoon while floating on inflatable chairs and playing pool games. Around 3 in the afternoon, one friend decided to execute what he considered a harmless prank. He positioned himself in the shallow end, submerged his face underwater, and remained motionless for several seconds with his arms floating limply. Within moments, someone noticed and shouted that he wasn't moving. The group's attention focused immediately on the shallow end. Liam, positioned near the pool's far edge, hesitated for several seconds before reacting. Without verbal warning, Liam launched himself forward in a shallow, forceful headfirst dive from the pool deck toward the shallow end where his friend remained motionless. Multiple witnesses later described the dive as athletic and aggressive, with Liam's body fully extended and angled downward. His head struck the pool's concrete bottom with significant force in water approximately 4 feet deep. The impact produced a sharp, dull thud audible above the music and conversation. Liam's body went immediately limp, floating face down. A scalp laceration sustained on impact caused blood to spread through the water near his head. The friend executing the prank surfaced instantly, screaming. Others pulled Liam from the pool within seconds and laid him on the deck. He showed no purposeful movement and was not breathing normally. Rescue efforts, including CPR and assisted breathing, began immediately while emergency services were contacted. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Liam unresponsive with severe respiratory failure and unstable vital signs. He was transported under active resuscitation to a regional medical center, where physicians documented complete loss of neurological function. After consultation with family members, life support was withdrawn, and he was pronounced dead approximately 6 hours after the incident. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from a catastrophic fracture dislocation of the cervical spine at the C2 level caused by an axial load and hyperflexion injury, with complete spinal cord transection and associated brainstem trauma. The property owner later faced a wrongful death lawsuit that resulted in settlement and policy changes, and the pool was permanently removed from rental use and secured to prevent access. It was March 18, 2018, on Provincial Highway 214 in Hunan Province, China. Evening traffic moved steadily as 38-year-old delivery dispatcher Chen Wei drove toward his daughter's after-school tutoring center along a route he followed every weekday. Chen had worked for a regional logistics company for 12 years, coordinating shipments and managing driver schedule. Colleagues described him as the kind of person who ate lunch at the same time every day and drove the exact speed limit. His life revolved around routine, work, family, and the daily drive to collect his 10-year-old daughter from tutoring sessions that ended at 7:30 every weeknight. He drove a 7-year-old sedan that he maintained obsessively, changing the oil precisely every 3,100 miles. Highway 214 was a 2-lane road cutting through mixed residential and commercial areas. Evening traffic was moderate but steady, with vehicles traveling around 37 miles per hour. The stretch Chen traveled featured minimal street lighting and occasional roadside vendors closing up for the night. Visibility was adequate but not ideal once the sun dropped below the horizon. Chen knew every curve and intersection from repetition alone. That evening, 2 of Chen's former classmates were standing at the curb near a fruit vendor's stall, approximately 5 miles from the tutoring center. They'd been drinking at a nearby restaurant for several hours and decided to wait for Chen's predictable passage. One had purchased a realistic rubber snake from a novelty shop earlier that week. Their plan was simple: toss the snake onto Chen's windshield as he drove past, watch him brake or swerve because they knew about his phobia towards snakes, then reveal themselves for a laugh. The fruit vendor later told investigators she saw the 2 men laughing and heard one say something about timing. Chen's sedan approached at 7:52 in the evening. The street lighting in that section was sparse, and Chen was maintaining his usual speed. The 2 men waited until his car was close before one threw the rubber snake. Their aim was poor, but the object still struck the windshield directly in front of the driver's seat. The snake hit the glass with enough force to stick momentarily against the wiper blade. Chen's reaction was instantaneous and severe. He flinched and swerved violently to the left, a reflex triggered by his past fear of snakes. He never applied significant brake pressure. Forensic investigators later measured the tire marks, noting the vehicle had traveled only 20 feet along the road as it yawed across into the oncoming lane. A sedan traveling in the opposite direction had no time to react. The 2 vehicles collided head-on at a combined speed exceeding 110 kilometers per hour. The engine bay collapsed and the engine intruded into the footwell and upper firewall, crushing the front and deforming the steering column. Both vehicles came to rest in the middle of the road. The driver from the oncoming vehicle, who sustained moderate injuries, immediately called emergency services. 3 other drivers stopped and called within seconds. Paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Chen was unresponsive when rescuers reached him. The steering column had been driven into his chest, pinning him against the seat. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy confirmed severe blunt force trauma to the chest, including complete fracturing of the sternum and multiple ribs. A traumatic rupture of the thoracic aorta and surrounding vessels caused catastrophic internal hemorrhaging that investigators said would have been unsurvivable within seconds. Traffic investigators recovered pieces of the rubber snake lodged in the wiper assembly, which helped establish the initiating cause of the sudden swerve. Both men who threw the object were identified through witness statement and later charged with crimes related to endangering public safety resulting in death. Authorities classified the collision as preventable, closing the case after the forensic review concluded. It was September 6, 2017, somewhere outside a mid-sized town in rural Georgia, the kind of area where the roads get narrow fast and the tree line swallows everything once you're far enough in. That's where Corin Hadley ended up, not by accident, not by force, but entirely by choice. Corin was 27. He worked part-time as a delivery driver, picking up routes whenever they were available. Irregular hours, inconsistent pay, and a living situation to match. He rented a single room and largely kept to himself. No close family nearby, no one who checked in on him with any regularity. Most of his social life existed online through group chats and shared feeds, which is exactly where he came across the 48-hour missing challenge sometime in late August 2017. The premise was simple: disappear for 48 hours without telling anyone where you went. No contact, no updates. Then reappear and post about it. The reaction, the panic, the confusion, the relief, that was the content. And I think that says a lot about where social media was heading at that point. The performance wasn't the stunt itself. The performance was other people's reaction to it. Corin decided to do it alone. Before he left, he filmed a short video on his phone explaining what he was doing, vague on the details, but clear enough in intent, and posted it to his personal feed. He told one coworker in passing that he was going to be off the grid for 2 days. That was the full extent of his preparation. No supplies, no map, no plan beyond driving out, waiting it out, and driving back. On the afternoon of September 6th, he drove roughly 40 minutes outside of town and parked his car off the shoulder of a remote back road that cut through a stretch of dense woodland. The idea was probably to stay close enough to the car that finding his way back wouldn't be an issue. That assumption was the first and most costly mistake he made. He lost phone signal not long after leaving the main road. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cooler than he had dressed for. And with the humidity that comes with Georgia woodland at night, it felt significantly colder than that. He had no food, no water, no flashlight, and no way to call anyone, even if he had wanted to. He spent the first night moving to stay warm, which took him further from the road than he realized. By the morning of day 2, the landscape around him looked the same in every direction. He was disoriented and had been for hours without knowing it. He kept moving through day 2, dehydrated, underfed, and increasingly fatigued from a full night and day of exposure. His body was running on very little by the time darkness came again on the second night. Georgia woodland in early September holds heat through the day, but once the sun is gone and the humidity settles, the temperature drops faster than most people expect, especially when the body is already under physical stress. Sometime after dark, on September 7th, he attempted to cross a shallow creek running through the woods, using rocks along the surface as stepping points. The rocks were mossy. He was physically weakened, and his coordination had been compromised by over 30 hours of exposure and dehydration. On the second rock, he lost his footing and went down sideways, striking the right side of his head against a partially submerged flat rock with significant force. He lost consciousness immediately and fell face forward into the creek. The water was roughly 9 inches deep, shallow, but enough to cover the airway of someone face down and unresponsive. The margin between those two things is so small, it's hard to process. He remained there, unresponsive. A driver passing along the back road the following morning noticed his car had been parked in the same spot for 2 days and flagged it. That detail, combined with a video still visible on his personal feed, gave searchers enough to work with in terms of direction and intent. Corin was found face down in the creek approximately 31 hours after he had driven out. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force head trauma followed by drowning while unconscious. The case was ruled an accidental death. No other parties were involved and no foul play was suspected. What gets me about Corin's case is that he posted the video before he left. He documented his own plan. He just never accounted for the part where the plan stopped working.
It was April 28th, 2020, late on a Thursday afternoon in a suburban neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The street was lined with single-family homes and most residents were still at work. The neighborhood was quiet except for distant sounds of traffic. Sutton Amara was 22 years old and in her senior year at a nearby university where she had been involved in campus theater productions since freshman year and was finishing up her communications degree. She was living at home with her parents and younger brother to save on expenses while commuting to campus. Friends later described her as curious and prone to following online trends, particularly content popular among her peer group. During the early months of the pandemic, a dangerous online trend emerged as more young adults spent time on social media during campus shutdowns. The challenge involved consuming large amounts of diphenhydramine, a common over-the-counter allergy medication that can cause hallucinations, seizures, cardiac arrhythmias, and death at high doses. Participants filmed themselves taking far beyond the recommended amount to document the altered effects, despite warnings from medical professionals that had not reached all viewers. That afternoon, Sutton was home alone while both parents were still at work and not expected to return for approximately 2 hours. She had been watching videos related to the challenge over the previous week and decided to attempt it herself. She had purchased a bottle of the medication at a pharmacy several days earlier without difficulty. She went to her room, set up her phone to record, and removed 24 tablets from the bottle. Each tablet contained 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine. Standard dosing was 1 or 2 tablets every 4 to 6 hours. The amount she selected represented a dose exceeding 1,000 milligrams, a level associated with life-threatening toxicity. She swallowed the tablets over several minutes while the camera recorded. Initial effects began within the first hour. Diphenhydramine at toxic doses acts as a powerful anticholinergic, disrupting normal nervous system function. Sutton became increasingly disoriented, with blurred vision, dry mouth, and difficulty focusing. She remained alone in her room with the recording still running. Approximately 90 minutes after ingestion, her condition worsened rapidly. Her heart rate became markedly elevated as the drug interfered with normal cardiac conduction. Witnesses who later reviewed portions of the footage described her pacing unsteadily, appearing confused and distressed, though she did not attempt to call for help. Shortly thereafter, she suffered a generalized tonic-clonic seizure that lasted more than 2 minutes. She remained unconscious afterward, and a second seizure followed several minutes later. The toxic effects of the overdose caused severe electrical instability in both her brain and heart. Her father arrived home around 5:40 and went upstairs when she did not respond to his calls. He found her unresponsive on the floor with the phone still recording. He called emergency services while checking for breathing and pulse, both of which were weak and irregular. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and found Sutton in a life-threatening cardiac arrhythmia. They began resuscitation and transported her to a nearby emergency department under active CPR. Despite aggressive treatment, including medications and repeated defibrillation, she could not be revived and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrhythmia with seizure activity due to acute diphenhydramine toxicity. with toxicology confirming a severe overdose. Her family later issued a public warning, and several pharmacy chains reviewed and reinforced existing purchase guidelines.
It was April 9th, 2014, when morning sun lit the red rock formations surrounding a popular hiking overlook outside Sedona, Arizona. The desert air was cool and still as trail dust settled along the narrow path. A guardrail marked the designated viewing area, beyond which the terrain dropped steeply. Tyler Brandt was 19 years old and had recently completed his freshman year at a state university, where he pledged a fraternity known for wealthy membership and exclusive social events. 5'11" and 155 pounds, he came from a middle-class background and worked 2 part-time jobs to afford fraternity dues. Former classmates described him as eager to prove himself among more affluent peers. That spring break morning, Tyler was hiking with 5 fraternity brothers on a trail system winding through red rock formations. The group reached a scenic overlook where the terrain dropped approximately 120 feet onto jagged rock below. The viewing area was protected by cable railings and posted warning signs restricting access beyond the barrier. The group had been drinking throughout the morning, carrying mixed drinks and water bottles. Though no one appeared heavily intoxicated, alcohol had accumulated over several hours. Fraternity members continued testing Tyler's loyalty through escalating challenges, a pattern that had persisted throughout his pledge period. At the overlook, attention shifted toward trust. One fraternity member asserted that a hidden ledge existed just beyond the visible edge, a claim supported by 2 others who showed images on their phones. Investigators later determined the story was fabricated and had no basis in the terrain. Tyler hesitated, approaching the edge and looking down. The drop appeared sheer and uninterrupted. The fraternity members continued to pressure him, questioning his courage and suggesting he lacked commitment to the group. They pointed to an open stretch of slick rock and dirt beyond the guardrail, roughly 40 feet from the protected area, claiming the ledge would become visible only after committing to the run. After several minutes of escalating peer pressure, Tyler stepped beyond the protective railing. The ground consisted of loose dirt and scattered gravel over smooth rock, sloping slightly downward toward the cliff edge. The others positioned themselves several yards back, with phone cameras raised, continuing to encourage him. Tyler began running. He accelerated across the open ground toward the edge. Roughly 15 feet from the drop, witnesses later reported his expression changed as he appeared to recognize there was no ledge. He tried to stop abruptly, his shoes losing traction on the loose surface as he leaned backward and windmilled his arms. His momentum carried him forward. He went over the edge, still upright, and disappeared from view. Seconds later, the sound of impact echoed up from the rocks below. The fraternity members rushed to the edge. Tyler's body was visible on the rocks, approximately 120 feet below, motionless. Several members called emergency services, while others began shouting and crying. Rescue personnel required nearly 2 hours to reach the location and recover Tyler's body using technical climbing equipment. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from catastrophic blunt force trauma, with injuries incompatible with life. Fatal fractures were present in the skull, spine, and multiple long bones, along with extensive internal organ damage, indicating death occurred at impact. The fraternity was immediately suspended from campus activities pending investigation, and the university permanently revoked its charter 4 months later. Tyler's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against the national organization and several individual members. The trail's managing authority later installed additional barriers and warning signage, restricting access to informal areas near the overlook to reduce future risk.
It was February 20th, 2017, a Thursday afternoon on a private rural estate outside Sorocaba, São Paulo State, Brazil. The land ran to about 106 acres of red-earthed pasture and scrub. The main house sat on a rise at the center. A reinforced secondary structure sat about 260 feet to the north. Renato Figueiredo was 44 and had made his money in agricultural land brokerage. By his late 30s, he had accumulated enough to withdraw from active work entirely. He had loved lions since childhood. When he had enough money to act on it, he did not hesitate. Private ownership of big cats in Brazil was illegal outside licensed zoos and research facilities, though enforcement in remote rural areas was inconsistent. Renato had the land, the structure, and enough distance from anyone who might ask questions. The lion, a 4-year-old male Renato had named Simba, had been transported from the Paraguayan border through a cross-border arrangement. He weighed 472 pounds at his last recorded measurement. Renato photographed him regularly and posted images to a private social media account. Friends responded with a mixture of admiration and concern. I want to pause here for a second, because Renato had fired the one person on his property who actually knew what they were doing. Then he was alone out there with a 472-pound lion and a camera. I'm baffled. Over the year following the departure of his caretaker, Renato developed what he described to friends as a relationship with Simba. He had begun presenting meat at the feeding window, allowing Simba to approach, and then withdrawing it at the last moment before sliding it through. He filmed it several times. In one video, he laughed audibly as Simba's head snapped forward and found nothing. A friend commented that he was going to get himself killed. Renato replied with a laughing emoji. He had been doing it for 7 months. On that afternoon, Renato approached the enclosure at the usual feeding time, carrying about 6.5 pounds of raw beef. The heat was pushing 100 degrees. He raised the sliding panel and extended the meat into the opening. Simba came to the window. Renato pulled the meat back. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Simba did not follow the meat. He lunged forward and drove his head partially through the feeding window, his jaws closing on Renato's right arm at the mid-forearm. Both forearm bones fractured on contact. The lion pulled back through the opening, taking Renato's arm with it to the elbow before the angle of the window frame arrested the motion. Renato's screaming was heard at the main house by his housekeeper, who called emergency services at 3:14 p.m. Renato was conscious when first responders arrived, but in severe hemorrhagic shock. Simba had not released the arm. A veterinarian was dispatched from Sorocaba. The sedation process took 22 minutes from arrival to full effect. Renato was transported to hospital with a traumatic degloving injury from the mid-forearm to the wrist, complete fracture of both forearm bones, and vascular damage to the brachial artery. His surgical team described his condition as critical on arrival. He received emergency vascular surgery and was placed in intensive care. He died at 11:52 p.m. The cause of death was hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic vascular injury sustained in an animal attack. Authorities attended the property the following morning. Simba and 2 wildcats in an adjoining section were seized. Simba was euthanized on site. An investigation was opened into the origin and transport of the animals. 3 individuals connected to the cross-border brokerage were identified for questioning.
It was September 24th, 2019, and Interstate 95 stretched through northern Virginia under afternoon sun, the highway thick with commuter traffic moving at highway speeds. 3 lanes carried vehicles in both directions, separated by concrete Jersey barriers with minimal shoulder clearance. Angela Torres was 42 years old and worked as a commercial real estate agent, specializing in office properties throughout the Washington metropolitan area. She drove approximately 30,000 miles annually for showings and client meetings. Her driving record showed multiple speeding citations over the previous 5 years. and colleagues later described her as frequently distracted behind the wheel, often handling phone calls and reviewing documents while driving. That Tuesday afternoon, Angela was returning home from a property showing with her 16-year-old daughter in the passenger seat. The teenager had been creating content for social media throughout the day, filming pranks and reaction videos as part of an ongoing series. She had recently gained a modest following through clips that captured startled responses from family members. Traffic was moderate, with vehicles traveling around 70 miles per hour in the middle lane where Angela was driving. Her attention was divided between the road and a conversation about weekend plans. The daughter had concealed a compressed air horn, commonly used at sporting events, in her lap while her phone camera remained pointed toward her mother. Without warning, the daughter activated the air horn directly behind Angela's head. The device produced a deafening blast inside the enclosed vehicle, capable of exceeding 110 decibels at close range. The sound was captured clearly on the phone's recording. Angela's reaction was immediate and involuntary. She gasped and made an abrupt steering input to the left as her upper body tensed. The vehicle drifted into the left lane almost immediately, narrowly missing a sedan that braked sharply. Startled and disoriented, Angela overcorrected, turning the wheel hard to the right. The vehicle swerved across multiple lanes, cutting off several cars. Angela was unable to regain full control as the car continued toward the right shoulder, mounted the narrow edge of pavement, and struck the concrete barrier at an estimated speed of 65 miles per hour. The impact was glancing and angular, redirecting the vehicle into a counterclockwise spin while it scraped along the barrier for roughly 80 feet. The car came to rest, partially blocking the right lane, its front end heavily damaged and the driver's side crushed from prolonged barrier contact. Multiple witnesses stopped and called emergency services. The daughter was screaming, but conscious and able to move. Angela remained in the driver's seat, unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within 14 minutes as other motorists assisted with traffic control. Angela was unconscious with severe head and chest injuries, and mechanical tools were required to extricate her from the vehicle. She was transported to a regional trauma center where physicians worked for more than an hour to stabilize her condition, but her injuries were determined to be non-survivable. She was pronounced dead approximately 90 minutes after the crash. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe traumatic brain injury with skull fractures, combined with extensive internal chest trauma, including cardiac contusion, pulmonary laceration, and hemothorax. The daughter's phone, recovered at the scene with the recording still active, was used as key evidence. The teenager was charged as a juvenile and later adjudicated delinquent, receiving detention, probation, and mandatory counseling. The footage was sealed by court order and approved for limited traffic safety education use, while the family fractured permanently in the aftermath. It was October 9th, 2014. The fluorescent lights hummed in the parking garage beneath a commercial office building in Johannesburg, South Africa. Joshua Masiko, a 29-year-old accounts coordinator at a mid-sized logistics firm, had just finished his shift. His co-workers lingered near their vehicle, watching him approach with an unusual level of attention. What appeared to be casual Friday afternoon banter would become a workplace tragedy that exposed the dangerous escalation of office culture gone wrong. Joshua had built his reputation at the logistics company over 5 years through competent work and relentless practical jokes. He regularly trapped colleagues in supply closets, hid personal belongings, including phones and car keys, and staged elaborate jump scares using masks and sudden noises. Managers had received multiple complaints, but Joshua dismissed critics as oversensitive and continued his behavior. He prided himself on pushing boundaries, often telling coworkers they were too soft about workplace humor and needed to learn how to take a joke. That afternoon, 5 coworkers implemented their plan to mirror Joshua's signature prank style. They had discussed teaching him a lesson by staging a fake kidnapping scenario, believing a brief scare would make him understand how his targets felt. The logistics firm had recently issued warnings about workplace conduct following a previous incident where Joshua had locked a colleague in a storage freezer for nearly 20 minutes. But no formal disciplinary action had been taken. When Joshua reached his vehicle around 5:30 in the afternoon, 3 coworkers grabbed him while 2 others recorded on their phones for proof of the prank. Joshua initially struggled, but quickly began laughing, recognizing the mimicry of his own tactics. He made jokes as they bundled him into the trunk of a coworker's sedan, assuming the experience would last only a minute or two. The group had not planned beyond getting him into the trunk. To enhance realism and muffle any shouting, one coworker started the engine and suggested leaving it running. The parking garage's ventilation system was operating, but someone had pulled the sedan into an isolated small service bay with a heavy maintenance door, and another coworker shut this door completely, cutting off airflow. The group moved to a different level to wait, planning to return after 5 minutes. The colorless, odorless gas is produced by vehicle engines and displaces oxygen in enclosed spaces. At concentrations above 70 parts per million, symptoms begin within hours. Above 400 parts per million, which occurs rapidly in sealed garages with running engines, unconsciousness happens within minutes and death follows quickly. 7 minutes passed before they returned to the service bay. Opening the maintenance door released a wave of exhaust fumes. They immediately opened the trunk and found Joshua unconscious and unresponsive. One coworker called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes but could not revive him. His skin showed the characteristic cherry red discoloration often seen in carbon monoxide poisoning. Police seized the phones and vehicle for forensic examination, extracting the original files and metadata from the recordings to preserve the timeline of events. The medical examiner's report was straightforward. Joshua had inhaled carbon monoxide at lethal concentrations that prevented oxygen from reaching his brain and heart. The binding of carbon monoxide to his blood cells caused cellular suffocation. Time of death was estimated at approximately 5:38 in the afternoon based on symptom progression and forensic analysis. All 5 coworkers faced criminal charges, including culpable homicide. Investigators documented Joshua's history of similar pranks, noting a pattern of escalating workplace behavior that management had failed to address. The logistics company faced civil liability for inadequate intervention despite previous complaints.
It was January 29th, 2019. Arctic air gripped suburban Minneapolis as temperatures plunged below zero. Fresh snow covering quiet residential yards, while pale morning light settled over a fenced backyard. Marlo Keegan was 28 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator for a regional insurance company, managing social media accounts and digital campaigns. Outside of work, she maintained an active personal presence across multiple platforms, posting lifestyle content to several thousand followers. Friends later described her as highly focused on engagement metrics and follower growth, often planning posts around trending topics to maximize visibility. That morning, a viral cold weather trend was spreading across social media. People filmed themselves throwing boiling water into freezing air to create a burst of ice crystals, and the ongoing polar vortex pushed hundreds of similar clips online within days. The effect looked simple, fast, and visually dramatic, drawing attention from creators chasing engagement. Marlo decided to try it herself. She set her phone on a backyard tripod and framed the shot to capture both her movement and the vapor cloud. After watching a few examples, she prepared the setup without fully understanding the risks, unaware that shifting wind and fragmented droplets could redirect heat back toward the person filming. Marlo brought a pot containing several liters of water to a rolling boil and carried it outside, steam rising into the freezing air. She stood about 5 feet from the camera, angling her body toward the lens to keep her face visible. The wind seemed calm during setup, but the cold air remained unpredictable. She began recording and swung the pot in a wide motion, throwing the boiling water upward and to her right. At the moment of release, a sudden gust of wind came from behind her, altering the trajectory of the water mid-throw. Instead of dispersing away from her body, a portion of the boiling liquid fragmented into droplets, and along with a dense cloud of high-temperature steam, was driven directly back toward her face and upper chest. Marlo reacted instinctively, gasping as the redirected spray made contact with her mouth and nose. Several droplets struck her lower face and lips, while steam enveloped her head at close range. The reflexive inhalation drew a mixture of hot vapor and aerosolized water into her upper airway. She stumbled backward, dropping the pot into the snow, and collapsed to her knees as the recording continued. Thermal injury to the airway can occur rapidly when hot vapor or liquid is inhaled. Burns to the mouth, throat, and larynx can trigger swelling that progresses over several minutes as tissue reacts to heat exposure. Marlo's breathing became harsh and strained, producing high-pitched sounds as airflow narrowed. She remained conscious but was unable to speak or call out. Her husband, who had been inside the house, heard the pot strike the ground and reached the backyard within roughly 30 seconds. He found Marlo seated in the snow, burned around the mouth and chin, clutching her throat and struggling to breathe. She was unable to speak, and her breathing was increasingly labored. He called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and found Marlo in severe respiratory distress, with visible swelling around the mouth and airway. Oxygen levels continued to decline despite supplemental oxygen, and attempts to secure an airway became increasingly difficult as swelling limited visualization and access. She lost consciousness during the transport and suffered cardiac arrest shortly before arrival, where she was pronounced dead. They later determined the cause of death to be asphyxiation, due to thermal injury and upper airway edema. The recovered video was later referenced in public safety warnings, and platforms added caution labels to similar content.
It was September 18, 2019, in Seville, Spain. The block sat quiet most evenings after closing hours, bordered on one side by a shadowed alley barely 6 feet wide. A single illuminated sign above the shop's side entrance jutted outward from the brick wall, suspended by 2 aging metal brackets that had been rattling loose for nearly a week. Mateo Vargas was 17 years old and lived 2 blocks from the shop. He had spent most of his teenage years working small jobs around the neighborhood, including occasional weekend shifts at his uncle's garage, sweeping floors and helping with basic inventory. He was considered dependable. Family members trusted him with minor tasks without concern. He had climbed onto the shop roof once before during a previous repair and had not reported any problems. That evening, his uncle Javier had asked him before locking up to bring a couple of friends and tighten the sign's loose mounting bolts before the overnight storm arrived. Just after 10 p.m., Mateo arrived at the back of the shop with 2 friends from the neighborhood, Ivan and Sergio, both 16. They brought a flashlight, an adjustable wrench, and an aluminum maintenance ladder pulled from inside the garage. The streets had already gone quiet. The only sounds were distant highway traffic and the low hum of nearby air conditioning units. None of them brought any safety equipment. The rooftop was flat, but poorly maintained. Loose gravel covered most of the surface in uneven patches. Ventilation pipes and electrical conduit ran in several directions across the surface. The illuminated sign extended roughly 4 feet out from the wall above the alley entrance. To reach the outer bracket properly, a person had to crouch near the roof's edge and lean forward over open air approximately 22 feet above the alley floor. Matteo worked through the upper bolts one at a time while Ivan held the flashlight. Sergio drifted around the rooftop without purpose, kicking at loose pebbles and making noise about shadows in the alley below. The repair took close to 20 minutes and proceeded without incident until the final bracket. The outer bracket continued to shift under pressure. Each time Matteo applied torque with the wrench, the frame moved instead of the bolt threading tighter. He repositioned himself several times, eventually planting his right foot near the roof's edge to get a better angle on the hardware. Loose gravel shifted slightly beneath his shoe as he leaned forward toward the sign frame. Earlier that evening, after watching a football match at a cafe downtown, Sergio had picked up a small portable air horn during the street celebrations outside. He had carried it in his backpack all evening without using it. Standing behind one of the rooftop ventilation units and watching Matteo crouch near the ledge, he removed it quietly. Ivan noticed and said nothing and just chuckled. At this point, all I can say is that this is very dumb. Then he blew it once across the open rooftop. Matteo's body reacted before his mind could process the source. He jerked backward sharply, and the sole of his right shoe dragged across the loose gravel near the ledge. He reached out for the sign frame to steady himself. The loosened outer bracket twisted violently under his grip instead of holding. The entire sign frame lurched outward from the wall. He remained partially upright for less than 2 seconds. Then he went over the edge. The fall was approximately 22 feet onto a concrete alley floor. He landed on his back and right side. He did not move after impact. The air horn clattered out of Sergio's hand and rolled across the rooftop gravel. Neither boy moved for several seconds, then both ran to the ledge. Ivan called emergency services at 10:31 p.m. The call lasted under a minute. He gave the address and said his friend had fallen from a roof. He did not mention the air horn during the call. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and found Matteo unresponsive in the alley. He had sustained a severe traumatic brain injury from the impact, along with fractures to 3 ribs, his right clavicle, and his right forearm. He was transported to a hospital in critical condition. Matteo Vargas died the following morning at 7:14 a.m. He had not regained consciousness. Ivan and Sergio were brought in for questioning separately the same night at the local police station. Both were accompanied by their parents. Sergio disclosed the air horn during his interview after initially omitting it from his account. Investigators recovered the device from the rooftop the following morning. Both teenagers were released into parental custody. Matteo's family did not speak publicly after his death. His uncle closed the shop for 2 weeks following the incident.
March 18, 2018, on Provincial Highway 214 in Hunan Province, China. Evening traffic moved steadily as 38-year-old delivery dispatcher Chen Wei drove toward his daughter's after-school tutoring center along a route he followed every weekday. Chen had worked for a regional logistics company for 12 years, coordinating shipments and managing driver schedules. Colleagues described him as the kind of person who ate lunch at the same time every day and drove the exact speed limit. His life revolved around routine, work, family, and the daily drive to collect his 10-year-old daughter from tutoring sessions that ended at 7:30 every weeknight. He drove a 7-year-old sedan that he maintained obsessively, changing the oil precisely every 3,100 miles. Highway 214 was a 2-lane road cutting through mixed residential and commercial areas. Evening traffic was moderate but steady, with vehicles traveling around 37 miles per hour. The stretch Chen traveled featured minimal street lighting and occasional roadside vendors closing up for the night. Visibility was adequate, but not ideal once the sun dropped below the horizon. Chen knew every curve and intersection from repetition alone. That evening, 2 of Chen's former classmates were standing at the curb near a fruit vendor's stall, approximately 5 miles from the tutoring center. They'd been drinking at a nearby restaurant for several hours and decided to wait for Chen's predictable passage. One had purchased a realistic rubber snake from a novelty shop earlier that week. Their plan was simple: Toss the snake onto Chen's windshield as he drove past. Watch him brake or swerve because they knew about his phobia towards snakes, then reveal themselves for a laugh. The fruit vendor later told investigators she saw the two men laughing and heard one say something about timing. Chen's sedan approached at 7:52 in the evening. The street lighting in that section was sparse, and Chen was maintaining his usual speed. The two men waited until his car was close before one threw the rubber snake. Their aim was poor, but the object still struck the windshield directly in front of the driver's seat. The snake hit the glass with enough force to stick momentarily against the wiper blade. Chen's reaction was instantaneous and severe. He flinched and swerved violently to the left, a reflex triggered by his past fear of snakes. He never applied significant brake pressure. Forensic investigators later measured the tire marks, noting the vehicle had traveled only 20 feet along the road as it yawed across into the oncoming lane. A sedan traveling in the opposite direction had no time to react. The two vehicles collided head-on at a combined speed exceeding 110 kilometers per hour. The engine bay collapsed, and the engine intruded into the footwell and upper firewall, crushing the front and deforming the steering column. Both vehicles came to rest in the middle of the road. The driver from the oncoming vehicle, who sustained moderate injuries, immediately called emergency services. 3 other drivers stopped and called within seconds. Paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Chen was unresponsive when rescuers reached him. The steering column had been driven into his chest, pinning him against the seat. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy confirmed severe blunt force trauma to the chest, including complete fracturing of the sternum and multiple ribs. A traumatic rupture of the thoracic aorta and surrounding vessels caused catastrophic internal hemorrhaging that investigators said would have been unsurvivable within seconds. Traffic investigators recovered pieces of the rubber snake lodged in the wiper assembly, which helped establish the initiating cause of the sudden swerve. Both men who threw the object were identified through witness statement and later charged with crimes related to endangering public safety, resulting in death. Authorities classified the collision as preventable, closing the case after the forensic review concluded.
It was October 2nd, 2018, and evening had settled over a large state university campus in Pennsylvania. A residence hall on the north side housed primarily first-year students in shared rooms arranged along fluorescent-lit corridors. Cassius Thorne was 19 years old and in his first semester at the university, enrolled in a general studies program. He shared a small dorm room with another freshman, and the two had developed a casual friendship based on shared interests in gaming and online content. Both spent significant time watching video platforms featuring challenge-based videos. During this period, an older challenge format had experienced renewed attention. The challenge involved swallowing a tablespoon of ground cinnamon without any liquid. The substance's fine, dry texture made it nearly impossible to swallow in that quantity without coughing, and the resulting struggle was often presented as humorous. Most participants coughed violently and abandoned the attempt without serious injury. However, the challenge carried a serious but often overlooked risk. Forceful coughing could drive fine cinnamon particles deep into the lungs, where they could not be easily cleared, triggering severe inflammation known as aspiration pneumonitis. While most cases caused only temporary irritation, rare hospitalizations and isolated deaths had been documented after large-scale inhalation. That evening, Cassius and his roommate had been watching compilation videos and discussed attempting one themselves, settling on the cinnamon challenge due to its apparent simplicity. The roommate agreed to film. They returned to their dorm room, and Cassius retrieved a tablespoon and ground cinnamon from the floor's shared kitchen. He sat on his desk chair, facing the camera, filled the spoon with a heaping amount of cinnamon, and confirmed that the recording had started. Cassius placed the entire spoonful into his mouth at once. The immediate effect was an inability to swallow, as the powder absorbed moisture and formed a thick, dry mass. Within seconds, he began coughing violently. The reflexive coughing expelled a cloud of cinnamon powder from his mouth and nose, but the sharp inhalations between coughs drew fine particles deep into his airways and lungs. The coughing continued for more than a minute. His face reddened, and his eyes watered as he struggled to clear his airway. His roommate stopped recording and offered him water, which Cassius drank between coughs. The coughing gradually subsided, though he continued clearing his throat and complained of chest irritation. Both treated the attempt as a failed stunt. Over the next 12 hours, Cassius developed progressively worsening symptoms. He went to bed, but woke repeatedly coughing and feeling short of breath. By morning, he had developed a fever and was breathing rapidly with visible effort. His roommate suggested visiting the campus health center, but Cassius initially declined. By afternoon, his condition had deteriorated further. He was coughing up discolored sputum, his fever had increased, and he became severely winded with minimal movement. His roommate contacted their resident advisor, who called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and found Cassius in severe respiratory distress with low oxygen levels. He was transported to a regional medical center where imaging revealed widespread lung inflammation linked to inhaled cinnamon particles. He was admitted to intensive care, but his condition continued to worsen. Over the following days, his lungs failed to adequately exchange oxygen, progressing into acute respiratory distress syndrome. He was placed on mechanical ventilation, but complications from severe airway injury and infection led to multi-organ failure. He died several days after attempting the Cinnamon Challenge. Investigators later reviewed the phone recording to confirm the sequence of events, and the medical examiner ruled the death accidental. The university issued safety advisories through residence halls, warning students about similar online stunts.
It was November 22nd, 2015, and the living room of a suburban New Jersey split-level home was filled with extended family. Afternoon light filtered through half-closed blinds as conversations overlapped across couches and folding chairs crowded with relatives. The lingering smell of roasted turkey drifted in from the kitchen, while a football game played quietly on the television. Dorothy Weston was 67 years old and had recently retired after 41 years, working as an intensive care nurse within a regional hospital network. Her career involved managing critically ill patients and enforcing strict medication protocols. Family members described her as clinically precise but increasingly rigid about her own health management. She openly opposed what she believed was recreational drug culture, particularly marijuana legalization, which she always preached the underestimated medical risks of, despite shifting public attitudes. That Sunday afternoon marked the family's extended Thanksgiving gathering, with approximately 15 relatives present. Dorothy's grandson, Ethan Weston, was 21 years old and a community college student, and had brought a tray of brownies he claimed were made from a family recipe. Unbeknownst to Dorothy, the brownies had been prepared using concentrated cannabis-infused butter, with each serving containing a high dose of THC. Investigators later learned Ethan believed the edible would help his grandmother relax and reconsider her views. Dorothy took daily medication for hypertension and atrial fibrillation, including a beta blocker and a prescription anticoagulant. She had casually mentioned her medication routine earlier in the afternoon. Her grandson was aware of her prescriptions, but had not researched the physiological risks cannabis could pose to older adults with underlying cardiac conditions. Dorothy consumed one brownie around 3 o'clock while watching the game. She remarked that it tasted unusual, but finished it. Within about 40 minutes, relatives noticed she had become quiet and withdrawn. Her responses grew confused and disorganized, and her speech became slurred when addressed directly. By 4:30, her condition had worsened noticeably. She struggled to stand without assistance and appeared increasingly disoriented. Her daughter, a physician assistant, recognized signs of severe intoxication and questioned what Dorothy had eaten. The grandson initially denied adding anything unusual, but admitted the truth after the remaining brownies were discovered. Emergency services were called at 4:38. Dorothy's blood pressure dropped sharply, and her heart rhythm became unstable. She lost consciousness while paramedics were en route. Responders arrived within 12 minutes and found her unresponsive with a weak, irregular pulse and profound hypotension. Advanced life support measures were initiated, and she was transported to a nearby emergency department. Despite aggressive efforts to stabilize her cardiovascular status, she developed a malignant arrhythmia and suffered complete cardiovascular collapse approximately 2 hours after arrival. Resuscitation attempts continued for 40 minutes without success. She was pronounced dead at approximately 7:40 p.m. The medical examiner determined that Dorothy died from a fatal cardiac arrhythmia related to underlying atrial fibrillation and cardiovascular disease, with cannabis intoxication listed as a contributing factor. Toxicology confirmed elevated THC levels consistent with ingestion of a high-dose edible, which investigators concluded precipitated severe hypotension and cardiac instability in a medically vulnerable patient. Ethan was charged with reckless endangerment and food tampering, and later accepted a plea agreement resulting in a felony conviction, probation, and mandatory community service. The incident permanently fractured the family, with several relatives severing contact in the aftermath.
It was March 21st, 2017, when afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds of a second-floor bedroom in a split-level home outside Dayton, Ohio. The room belonged to a college sophomore, its walls decorated with posters and sports equipment scattered across the floor. The house was empty. Dalton Reeve was 20 years old and in his second year at a nearby community college, where he was studying business administration and playing on an intramural basketball team. He had been active on social media for several years and spent increasing amounts of time consuming video content on platforms popular with his age group. His parents, who he still lived with, later reported that his screen time had grown substantially, though they had not observed behavior they considered alarming. During this period, a particularly dangerous challenge had gained visibility among younger users. Participants attempted to restrict blood flow and airflow through the neck by applying pressure around it, filming themselves until they lost consciousness. The videos were framed as demonstrations of control or fearlessness. The challenge had already resulted in multiple deaths in other countries, though this information was not widely known among users at the time. Dalton had watched numerous videos featuring the challenge over the previous 2 weeks and discussed it with friends, some of whom claimed to have tried it themselves. On the afternoon in question, he was home alone, with several hours before anyone was expected to return. He set up his phone on his desk, with the camera facing his bed. The mechanics were deceptively simple but critically dangerous. Participants typically used a belt or cord to create a ligature around the neck, tightening it to compress the structures of the neck, including blood vessels supplying the brain. The intended effect was rapid loss of consciousness, which participants believed would last only seconds before they naturally released the ligature. This assumption was fundamentally flawed. Once consciousness was lost, muscle control disappeared entirely, allowing the ligature to remain tightened and continued depriving the brain of oxygen. Dalton positioned himself, sitting on the edge of his bed with his back to the camera. He wrapped a leather belt around his neck, threading the end through the buckle to form a loop. He started the recording, confirmed that he was visible in the frame, and began pulling the belt tighter with both hands. Witnesses who later reviewed the footage described a rapid progression. Within approximately 15 to 20 seconds, Dalton's movements became uncoordinated As he slumped sideways onto the bed, his body weight kept the belt tightened against his neck. He remained visible in the frame, motionless except for occasional involuntary movements that gradually ceased. The recording continued for more than 8 minutes before his mother arrived home. She called his name from downstairs and received no response, then went upstairs and entered his room. She found him unresponsive with the belt around his neck and immediately called emergency services while attempting to remove the ligature. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes and began resuscitation efforts, but Dalton had been without adequate oxygen for too long. He was transported to a nearby hospital and placed on life support. Neurological assessments over the next 2 days showed no brain activity, and his family later withdrew support. He was pronounced dead on the 3rd day. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be anoxic brain injury due to ligature strangulation, classified as accidental. The phone was secured as evidence, and local authorities later issued warnings through area colleges and the surrounding community.
It was December 11th, 2015. The commercial district of Dubai hummed with afternoon activity as workers at a regional food distribution warehouse prepared for the weekend shift change. The temperature outside hovered near 75 degrees, but inside the facility's cold storage units, it was a different world entirely. Omar Haddad was a 32-year-old inventory supervisor who had worked at the warehouse for 6 years. He came from a traditional family in Sharjah and took pride in doing everything by the book. His co-workers described him as inflexible and quick to report violations, no matter how minor. Omar's rigid enforcement extended beyond safety protocol. He documented tardiness, criticized packing methods, and had gotten 2 employees written up for eating near inventory zones. His supervisors valued his attention to detail, but his colleagues saw him as self-righteous and impossible to please. The tension had been building for months. That Friday afternoon, 4 co-workers decided Omar needed to be taught humility. They waited until he entered the walk-in freezer during his routine inspection. Walk-in freezers operate at -10 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring proper PPE and buddy system. Workers must understand that prolonged exposure without gear causes rapid hypothermia, while the heavy insulated doors require emergency releases accessible from inside. Omar had recently filed formal complaints about employees propping doors open and leaving forklifts unattended. Management sided with him each time, creating resentment among the team. As Omar stepped inside to verify temperature logs, they moved quickly. 2 men positioned themselves against the exterior door handle, holding it shut from outside. They planned to release him after 5 minutes, just long enough to scare him. Security cameras outside the freezer captured them, laughing and checking their phones while the door swung inward, showing their grip on the handle and the door slowly closing. The interior camera, designed for industrial cold conditions, recorded Omar moving inside despite the frigid temperature. Inside the freezer, Omar realized immediately what was happening. The metal door remained sealed despite his efforts. The temperature sat at -15 degrees, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. He wore only his standard uniform, no cold weather gear. Panic took over as the cold bit into his exposed skin. He rushed toward the interior emergency release mechanism mounted near the back wall. The floor tiles had accumulated condensation from the humidity difference when the door opened earlier. Omar's rubber-soled work shoes lost traction as he rushed toward the release. His feet went out from under him mid-stride, sending him sideways with significant force. His right temple struck the angled lip of a metal storage shelf at full momentum. He collapsed immediately, motionless, with a severe head wound. When the co-workers opened the door 4 minutes later, Omar lay motionless. One worker immediately called emergency services, while another attempted CPR. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and declared him dead at the scene. Investigators later confirmed a skull fracture had lacerated the middle meningeal artery, causing a rapidly expanding epidural hematoma that led to death within minutes. Omar's family held a funeral attended by over 300 mourners. They described him as devoted, principled, and meticulous in both work and life. The warehouse conducted a full safety review, installing upgraded emergency releases on all freezer doors and retraining staff on cold storage protocols. The 4 co-workers were charged with involuntary manslaughter. 2 received prison sentences of 4 years each, while the others got suspended sentences and deportation orders. In the months afterward, Omar's death remained a cautionary example in training sessions. It was April 22nd, 2017, in a mid-sized city in Nevada, the kind of place where apartment complexes stretch along flat desert roads and most residents keep to themselves. That's where Tessa Moorfield lived, quietly, mostly alone, in a 4-story building that nobody would have thought twice about. Tessa was 22. She worked part-time at a copy and print shop, picking up whatever shifts came her way during the week. She didn't have many people in her life. Most of her free time was spent alone in her apartment, online. She responded well to structure, someone who felt more settled when she had clear steps to follow and a goal at the end of it. And that's exactly what made her a target. On March 4th, 2017, 49 days before her death, she was contacted through a private messaging platform by an account presenting a 50-day structured challenge, similar to others that had been circulating online at the time, framed as self-improvement, organized, progressive, goal-driven. If I put myself in her position for a second, isolated, spending a lot of time online, responding well to routine, that probably felt like something worth trying, and that's the part that gets me. The first few tasks were nothing. Wake up at a specific time, watch a specific type of content, send a photo confirming you did it. Simple enough that most people wouldn't think twice about it, but photo confirmation was required from day one. Every task, every day, without exception. So before anything turned dark, Tessa had already spent weeks building the habit of documenting what she did and sending it back without questioning it. That was by design. What starts as a simple check-in system becomes the most controlling part. By the time the tasks escalate, compliance is already a reflex. She wasn't doing anything new, just continuing what she had been doing all along. By the second week, the tasks shifted: pull back from people, cut contact, stay awake through specific nights. Her neighbor noticed the blinds hadn't moved in days. Her car sat in the same spot all week. A coworker, who hadn't heard from her in over 2 weeks, sent a message and got nothing back. And with those connections already cut, no one saw the full picture until it was too late. By day 30, the tasks had moved into self-harm territory, still with photo confirmation required after each one. The account kept her compliant through a rotating mix of flattery and quiet threats, praise when she followed through, pressure when she hesitated. It was a system, and the more I look at how it was structured, the harder it is to call it anything other than deliberate, patient, and calculated. She stayed with it through day 40, day 45, all the way to day 49, when the final task was assigned. It came with a specific location, the rooftop of her own building. Just after 3 in the morning on April 22nd, Tessa went up to the rooftop through an unlocked utility door on the top floor, which had not been consistently secured. The rear side of the roof had a low perimeter ledge, roughly 18 inches high, with no railing and nothing between it and the parking lot 47 feet below. 47 feet. That number stopped me cold. She left her phone on the rooftop surface before walking to the ledge. It appeared to have been recording, consistent with how she had been documenting previous tasks. The camera was positioned facing outward and captured her crossing the rooftop and approaching the ledge before the battery died. It didn't capture everything, but it captured enough to establish what happened and in what order. A resident pulling into the rear parking lot after a night shift looked up and saw her standing on the ledge. That person was still in their car when she came off the edge. They were at the scene within seconds of impact. She was unresponsive. At 47 feet onto asphalt, there was nothing to survive. When her devices were reviewed, the full 49-day message thread was recovered, every task assigned, and every photo she sent as confirmation. The account had already been deactivated by the time investigators accessed it, but the records on her end were complete. Investigators concluded the messages played a direct role in the events leading to her death, and the case was ultimately classified as a suicide influenced by prolonged online interaction. No one in her immediate life was found to have any involvement. It was August 17th, 2018, at a downtown Portland parking structure that served the surrounding business district. The evening air was cooling as workers departed for the night. Fluorescent lights flickering across oil-stained concrete. The structure's 7 levels spiraled upward with tight corners and low clearance barriers. Jessica Carmine was 23 years old and worked as a paralegal assistant at a regional law firm, processing documents and managing case files for attorneys handling civil litigation. She had graduated 18 months earlier with a criminal justice degree and maintained an active interest in true crime media, spending evenings listening to podcasts and watching documentary series about unsolved abductions and violent crimes. Friends later described her as cautious to the point of paranoia, particularly regarding personal safety in parking areas. Her boyfriend of 14 months, Evan Morales, was 26 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator. He had spent 2 weeks planning an elaborate marriage proposal. His idea involved staging a fake kidnapping scare in which 2 friends wearing ski masks would confront Jessica near her vehicle before quickly revealing a romantic proposal setup nearby with flowers and candles. He had shared the plan with friends who expressed concern, but he dismissed their objections, convinced the surprise would be harmless. That Thursday evening, Jessica finished work around 6:30 and walked to her vehicle on the structure's 5th level. The area was mostly empty, with fewer than a dozen cars remaining. As she approached her sedan with keys in hand, 2 masked figures emerged from behind a concrete support pillar approximately 15 feet away. Both moved quickly toward her without speaking. Jessica's reaction was immediate and primal. She dropped her belongings and ran in the opposite direction, her breathing rapid and panicked. The 2 friends hesitated briefly before following at a distance, attempting to stop her, but she did not slow or turn back. She sprinted toward what she believed was the main elevator area, but instead entered a stairwell marked for emergency exit. The door closed behind her as she descended, taking the stairs 2 at a time. At the 3rd level landing, she pushed through an exit door that opened onto an exterior vehicle exit ramp adjacent to the structure. A delivery truck was accelerating up the ramp at that moment, preparing to merge into evening traffic. Jessica emerged directly into the driving lane without looking. The driver had no time to react. Impact occurred at approximately 25 to 30 miles per hour, throwing her body roughly 15 feet before it struck a concrete barrier. Multiple witnesses, including the 2 men involved in the prank, called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 9 minutes and found Jessica with catastrophic head injuries and minimal signs of life. She was transported during resuscitation efforts to a regional trauma center, where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe traumatic brain injury with skull fractures and extensive intracranial hemorrhaging, with additional rib fractures and internal organ damage contributing to rapid deterioration. Evan was later charged in connection with the incident and accepted a plea agreement that included probation and community service. Following the investigation, the parking structure's management installed additional warning signage and added physical barriers at emergency exits to prevent similar incidents.